Tonight I would tell you about some of the work that bears on my own research, improving elections. And I neglected to find out exactly how long I'm supposed to speak. Okay, so if there were no questions, I think this would take about 45 minutes, but I expect there will be questions. And you should feel free at any time to ask a question or make a comment or tell me I'm wrong. Just raise your hand. I may, if I think the answer is going to be too complicated, defer the discussion to the end of the talk, but you shouldn't wait until then, particularly if you're not following something I say. If something is unclear, let me know, and I'll try to clarify it. So how do we improve presidential elections? Well, let's start with an observation that I expect you all are aware of. Donald Trump is president of the United States, and an important question to try to answer is, how did this happen? Now, this is a question that can be answered at many levels, and I expect that it will be occupying scholars from many different fields for many years. I'm going to try to answer it at the particular level of the voting system. So what happens in the process of Trump getting elected? Well, the first thing he had to do was to become the Republican nominee. And he won a lot of the Republican primaries. He won 36 of them. And then, of course, he defeated Hillary Clinton in the general election. But one peculiar feature of his getting the nomination was that in the first 17 primaries that he won, there were more people voting against him than for him. And actually, this was true in the general election as well. Even in states where Trump won, such as, well, in particular, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. He won all those states, but in every one of them, there were more people who I would put in the anti-Trump category than the pro-Trump category. Now, this might sound paradoxical. How can someone who is so unpopular that there are more votes against him than for him actually win? But there's no contradiction. What happened in the primaries? Well, as I said, in the first 17 primaries that Trump won, he got less than 50% of the vote. There were more votes for other candidates than for Trump. In particular, in Arkansas, he got only 33%. So 2/3 of the voters were voting for someone else. But, and this is where Trump was lucky, he faced multiple opponents. In fact, he started out with 16 opponents. That was gradually narrowed down. But in particular, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich were all what we might call serious opponents. They were getting a serious number of voters, but the vote was split among them. And it's interesting to think about what might have happened had Trump been facing just one of these opponents. It's quite conceivable. We don't know for sure, but polls suggest that he could very well have lost. For example, fairly early on in the primary process, in early March, there was an ABC Newsweek poll indicating that both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were more popular than Trump, in the sense that if it had been a one-on-one contest between either of them and Trump, Trump would have lost. But of course, that experiment was not performed because both Rubio and Cruz were in the mix until the very end. And the fact that the vote was split over several candidates was what ensured that Trump got the nomination. Similar thing happened in the general election. In the states I mentioned before, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, et cetera, Trump got less than a majority and still managed to win. In particular, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which he won, the difference between his total and Hillary Clinton's total was considerably smaller than the number of people who voted for Jill Stein. Now, if you don't know who Jill Stein was, she was a progressive candidate, sort of left-wing candidate, who, if she had not been running, probably would have made Hillary Clinton's total bigger. I mean, the people who voted for Stein would not have voted for Trump, presumably. If they had voted for anyone, they would have voted for Clinton. So it's a reasonable conjecture to suggest that if Jill Stein had not been on the ballot, Clinton would have won those states, and those states were enough to give her the election. So vote splitting between Clinton and Stein also worked to Trump's in Trump's favor. Now, I'm talking about one particular election, the presidential election of 2016, but the phenomenon that I'm interested in, which is vote splitting, has been a recurrent theme in presidential elections. There have been many elections whose outcomes were strongly affected by vote splitting. One of the most famous was the presidential election of 2000. Now, most of you are too young to remember that election if you were even born then. Probably most of you weren't. But those of us of my age remember it very well. It was an extremely close election. It came down to one state, Florida, and it took about a month to count the votes in Florida. So we didn't know who was president until well into December. The point was that if George W. Bush won Florida, he would be president. If Al Gore won Florida, he would be president. In the end, Bush very, very narrowly defeated Gore by an absurdly small margin, fewer than 600 votes. But the point that I want to emphasize tonight is that in Florida, there were nearly 100,000 voters who voted for a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader. Nader had no chance of winning, either in Florida or anywhere else, but Nader served to take votes away from Gore because Nader was a like Gore, was to the left. And so people voting for Nader, most of them, probably an overwhelming number of them, would have voted for Gore had Nader not been running. And that difference, that 100,000 voter difference, was way more than enough to have given Gore the victory. There are other examples too. I have another example from 1992 when Bill Clinton ended up getting elected. He defeated George W. Bush's father, who was president at the time, but lost the election. An important reason why the older Bush lost the election was, again, there was a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who took votes mostly away from Bush. So what do all these examples show? They show that the system, the current voting system, is badly flawed. What is the current voting system? It's called plurality rule. In Britain, they call it first past the post. And it's a simple system, but as I say, it's highly flawed. So under plurality rule, each voter votes for a single candidate, and then the winner is simply the candidate who gets the most votes, even if that's not a majority. So when I say that this is the method used in American presidential elections, what I mean is that it's used in the primaries, the Democratic and Republican primaries, and it's also used by individual states in the general election to decide who gets the Electoral College votes from that state. So 48 out of 50 states have what are called winner-take-all contests in the general election. Whoever gets a plurality, whichever candidate gets a plurality of the votes in that state gets all that state's Electoral College votes. And as the examples I've been talking about, and I could give you plenty more examples, indicate plurality rule is highly vulnerable to vote splitting. And to be a little bit more precise about what I mean by vote splitting, I mean the idea that you have two or more similar candidates, like Marco Rubio and John Kasich, or like Jill Stein and Hillary Clinton, who split the vote between them and allow a very different candidates, like Donald Trump, to end up winning the election. Even though one or maybe more of the candidates who's getting their vote split would have defeated Donald Trump in a one-on-one contest. So one big question for tonight is, can we do better than that? Is there a better way of electing presidents? And the answer is yes. And if that's all you want, the answer, you can tune out now. But if you want to know why the answer is yes, stick around for a while. So the examples that I was giving you suggest that one problem with the current system, one problem with plurality rule, is that if voters are just identifying their favorite candidates, they're just voting for a single candidate, we're not really finding out enough about what other candidates they might like from the way that they're voting to make a good decision. So, for example, I was suggesting that if it had just been a contest between Rubio and Trump, or a contest between Kasich and Trump, Rubio and Kasich might have won. But in the actual election, there was no way for a Rubio voter to say, hey, I like Rubio, but I also like Kasich, and I would also vote for Kasich against Trump. There was no way that a voter had the opportunity to express herself in that way. And as I was saying, people who voted for Jill Stein in the general election had no opportunity of saying, look, I voted for Stein, but I certainly like Clinton better than Trump. No way of doing that. Same thing in the other examples. I won't go into that unless you want me to. So one part of the solution, this is not the full answer, but one part of the solution is to give voters the opportunity of expressing themselves more completely. And how do you express yourself more completely? Well, you should have the chance of ranking candidates, by which I mean you would say, well, I like Rubio the best, but if Rubio doesn't win, then I want Kasich. And I put Trump down at the bottom. Or if I'm a Trump supporter, I like Trump the best, but if Trump doesn't win, then I want Kasich, and then Rubio. So that gives voters more voice. But then there's a question of what we do with those rankings. And here's what I'm going to suggest. This is not an original voting method. In fact, it's a very old voting method. It goes back to the 18th century. It was proposed by the Marquis de Condorcet, who voting theorists like me revere, because he was probably the first true voting theorist. He studied election methods in detail, and he argued that majority rule, what we now call majority rule, which I will explain in a minute, is the right way to go. And here's how it works. Now, instead of voting for a single candidate, a voter submits a ranking. Now, you might say, well, it's too much trouble for me to rank all the candidates. If there are 17 Republican candidates in the primary, I don't want to rank all 17. But the point is, you don't have to rank all 17. You can rank as many or as few as you want. If you want to rank 4, that's fine. If you want to rank 9, that's fine. If you just want to submit one name, that's fine too. That's what you do under the current system. So the point is, you have a choice as a voter to rank as many of the candidates as you want, and then the outcome, the winner, is the candidate who, according to those rankings, once we have the rankings, we can see which candidate would actually defeat the other candidates in a head-to-head contest. So if there are 3 candidates, A, B, and C, candidate A wins if a majority of people rank A above B, and also a majority rank A above C. In that case, A is the clear majority winner. So that's what Condorcet proposed. Here's another example. This is a reasonably realistic example. I mean, these numbers are not intended to be completely accurate, but in some of the primaries, we had a breakdown somewhat similar to this. So here we have three groups of voters. We might call them the Trump voters, the Rubio voters, and the Kasich voters. And 40% of the population voting are Trump supporters. Now, what will happen in a situation like this? Well, if we use the current system, Trump is elected because, wait a second. There we are. Trump is elected because 40% of the people vote for Trump. That's more than either Rubio or Kasich gets. But if we use Condorcet's suggestion, then we do these pairwise comparisons, and we see that actually Kasich is the majority winner, because if we do a comparison between Kasich and Trump, we see that these people prefer Kasich to Trump, that's 35%, and these people prefer Kasich to Trump, that's 25%, and that adds up to 60%. That's a clear majority. It's a very handy majority. But Kasich also defeats Rubio, because these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and that adds up to 65%. So Kasich is the majority winner in this scenario, but you would never know it if you used plurality rule, the current system. You have to allow people to submit rankings. So let's look at another example. This again is fairly representative of what happened in Florida in the 2000 presidential election. Under plurality rule, which is what was used in Florida, Bush wins with 48.7% of the votes. But actually, Gore is the majority winner. And to see that, notice that Gore is more popular than Bush. These people vote for Gore over Bush. These people vote for Gore over Bush. That's over 50%. And Gore also defeats Nader. In fact, Gore defeats Nader overwhelmingly. So Gore is the true majority winner. We have a lot of reasons to believe that Gore was the actual majority winner in Florida, but again, the official results didn't record that. Now, I've been suggesting that majority rule, this method that Condorcet proposed 200 years ago, is what we should be doing. But why do I say that? Because once voters are submitting rankings, there are lots of voting systems that we could use. Why majority rule? For example, we could use what is called runoff voting. Lots of countries around the world use runoff voting to elect presidents. France does, Brazil does, Russia does, Romania does. How does runoff voting work? Well, it's voting in two steps. In round one, people vote for a single candidate, and if some candidate actually gets a majority in that first round, the election is over. But typically, no one gets a majority in the first round, and so what happens is that the top two vote getters in the first round move on to a runoff, and then it's a straight majority contest in the runoff. So you might have followed the recent French presidential election where Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen were the top two finishers in the first round, and they faced each other in the runoff, and Macron won, so he's now president. One way of doing runoff voting in a single round, so you don't have to have people coming back 2 weeks later, is to allow voters to rank candidates. So if we did, this is the same example that I looked at a few minutes ago. Suppose we did runoff voting for this configuration, the same configuration of Republican voters. What would happen? Well, nobody gets a majority in the first round. 40% of the people vote for Trump, 35% for Rubio, 25% for Kasich. No one gets a majority. The two top finishers are Trump and Rubio, right? So they would face each other in the runoff. And what would happen in the runoff? Well, Rubio would win because these people prefer Rubio to Trump, and so do these, and that adds up to 60%. So Rubio is the runoff winner, and that you see is different from both the plurality winner, who's Trump, and the majority winner, who is Kasich. But it may not be clear at this point why we should be using majority rule rather than runoff voting. And I see there's a question up there. I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
For the 25%, how do we assume that all 25% of those would still vote for Rubio?
Okay, so the question is, how do we know that in the second round, the voters who expressed a preference of Rubio over Trump will actually vote for Rubio over Trump in the second round? We don't know that. Of course, they're free to change their minds, but let's assume for the sake of argument that they've decided by the time they get into the voting booth in the first place that they like Rubio more than Trump, so they're not going to change their minds 2 weeks later. And you're right, they could change their mind, but for simplicity, let's not worry about that. Okay, so runoff voting, and for convenience, I'm going to look at runoff voting as a one-stage process where people are submitting rankings with the qualification that it's not quite right because people could change their minds. But if they don't change their minds, then we can do it all in one step. And you might ask, well, is runoff voting better than majority rule, or majority rule better than runoff voting? May not be clear. So how do we answer a question like that? And the way that a voting theorist like me tries to answer that question is to go back to first principles and first say to yourself, well, what do I want a voting rule to accomplish? What are the criteria or the requirements that any good voting rule ought to satisfy? And then, once we've specified those criteria, we can see which voting rule satisfies them, or maybe there's more than one that satisfies them, or maybe there's no voting rule that satisfies them, and then we would ask, well, which one comes closest to satisfying them? So that's the way that we do voting theory. Now, what are the criteria that make sense, that we would want a good voting rule to satisfy? Well, I think one obvious principle, and most of these principles I think you will agree are pretty obvious. One obvious principle is what we might call the consensus principle. For reasons I won't get into, economists call it the Pareto principle. Economists like to use weird jargon, but it's really the consensus principle. And what the consensus principle says is that if all voters agree that candidate A is better than candidate B, we shouldn't elect B. It would be pretty perverse if we elected B if everybody agrees that A is better. So, hard to argue with that. And not surprisingly, both majority rule and runoff voting satisfy this. Second principle, also extremely natural. Oh, question.
Am I right? For me personally, it seems that the first rule is not fulfilled, like as it says there, by the system that is established now. And it's always been said that a popular vote has been won by anti-Trump supporters.
Oh, okay. So remember, look at what this consensus principle says. It says that if everybody, not just a majority, but everybody agrees that A is better than B, B won't get elected.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's basically, if everybody has the same preferences, we better respect those preferences. Pretty uncontroversial. And the second principle is also a basic idea from democratic thinking going back thousands of years, the idea that we should treat all voters equally. All voters should have the same weight in the outcome. We shouldn't count some people's vote more heavily than others. Now, this is sometimes called the anonymity principle because that gets across the idea that a person's identity doesn't matter when they vote. All that should matter is the vote itself, not who is making that vote. Now, interestingly, this equal treatment principle is violated by the American Electoral College system. In particular, if you're a voter from Massachusetts, you do not have the same weight in the outcome as a voter from Wyoming or a voter from California. So depending on which state you're in, you have a bigger or smaller influence on the outcome. But within the states, within Massachusetts, when all voters count equally. So equal treatment fails at the Electoral College level, but is satisfied within states. And again, both majority rule and runoff voting treat voters equally. So far, no difference between them. And same is true of the third principle I want to talk about, which economists or voting theorists call neutrality. Neutrality is just the idea that just as we want to treat all voters equally, we want to treat all candidates equally. We don't want to give special favoritism to one candidate over another. They should all abide by rules that treat them all the same. and majority rule and runoff voting satisfy this neutrality principle as well. Not a big surprise. But the next principle does serve to distinguish between them. And this next principle is the one that I was talking about at the beginning, and that has to do with vote splitting. And there's a question here.
Could the argument be made that in the current system in America, this isn't true because candidates who are more extreme are, like, it's favored towards them because it's less likely for the Jill Stein situation to occur where someone is on the same side of the spectrum as you?
Okay, so you're quite correctly pointing out that the situation between Clinton and Stein was different from the situation with Trump. I mean, Trump was basically running unopposed on the right. Well, there was this libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, but it's not clear that Johnson was appealing more to the right than to the left. And then there was Jill Stein, who was definitely on the left, who was splitting the vote with Clinton. That's true, but that has nothing to do with the rules. The rules say that people vote for one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. The rules themselves are not biased toward one candidate or the other. What actually happens, of course, in the election itself might work for or against a particular candidate, but the rules themselves do not treat one candidate more favorably than another. An example of a biased rule would be one which says, well, the current president gets to stay president unless 2/3 of the voters vote for someone else. That would be biased because we're giving the incumbents a special advantage. Yeah.
Does the rejoined of electoral boundaries?
I'm sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
Does if you regulating the rejoined electoral boundaries, does that violate neutrality?
Okay, so you're talking about gerrymandering and that sort of thing. It does not violate neutrality formally because the rules say whoever is controlling the state legislature gets to define the boundaries. So the rules themselves don't discriminate between candidates. Neutrality is pretty easy to satisfy. Now, of course, in reality, what happens is that maybe the Republicans are controlling the state legislature, so they try to draw the lines in a way that favors Republicans, or in some cases, the Democrats might control the state legislature, so they want to redraw the lines to favor Democrats. That's true, but the rules themselves are neutral. So, okay, so now let me get to the principle which really does serve to distinguish between majority rule and runoff voting, and that's the idea that a voting rule should not be vulnerable to vote splitting. In the voting literature, this is sometimes called, and I'm not going to go into the details unless you want me to, it's sometimes called independence of irrelevant candidates, but the idea is that if candidates A and B are the serious candidates, like George W. Bush and Al Gore, then which one of them wins should not turn on whether some third candidate, like Ralph Nader, who has no chance of winning, is on the ballot or not. Now that principle is satisfied by majority rule. Remember we said that candidate A is the winner if A beats B by a majority and also beats C by a majority. If candidate C decides not to run after all, A still beats B by a majority. So C's decision whether to be on the ballot or not is not going to affect who ends up winning. So majority rule clearly satisfies the no vote splitting principle. But runoff voting violates it. Question?
So with this no vote splitting principle, you have candidate A, B, and C,
Yeah.
and you compare between when you have A versus B with C in the scenario, or the scenario with A, B, and C all competing at the same time. What if voters are saying, oh, I'll vote for A or I'll vote for B, but then some voters are saying, oh, I'll vote for C, but I don't care about the order of A and B, so they're randomly assigned that like I like A better or B better.
Well, all right, so let's go back to this example here. Here, there were three candidates, and we said that there were three groups of voters. It's possible that actually some of the Trump supporters actually like Rubio more than Kasich. Or some of them, maybe they didn't care about which of Rubio or Kasich was going to win. I mean, they really wanted Trump, and if Trump didn't win, they didn't care. Well, in that case, so what would a voter in the case where they didn't care about Rubio or Kasich do? They would just vote for Trump. That is, they wouldn't give a complete ranking. They'd just vote for Trump, and basically, Kasich and Rubio would be tied for second place. That's what voters do when they can't decide. They just leave that part of the ballot blank. There are many places around the world which allow voters to rank. And typically, voters do not rank all the candidates. They leave some of the spaces blank, either because they haven't thought about it or because they just don't care which of those candidates actually wins. Yeah.
So in the majority rule, if there's like a really close selection between candidates A and B, couldn't like a middle ground candidate, like candidate C, that had only gotten maybe like 1% of the vote, still win if they had been?
It's conceivable, and we'll actually talk about a case later where a candidate who is not getting that many first place votes might actually win, yes. But hold on to that question for a while. So I wanted to show you that runoff voting violates the no splitting principle. We already know the plurality rule violates no vote splitting. That was what I started my talk with, but no vote splitting does too. And I can use exactly the same example that I've been talking about, this three-group example. Remember, I said that if we had runoff voting in this scenario, Rubio would win, because Trump and Rubio would get to the runoff, and then it would be a contest between Trump and Rubio would win. But suppose that for some reason Trump decides not to run. What will happen then? Well, then it'll be a contest between Kasich and Rubio, and Kasich wins because these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and these people prefer Kasich to Rubio. That's 65%. And that's a majority. So runoff voting violates the no vote splitting principle. It matters very much whether a candidate like Trump, who in this scenario is not going to win, decides to run or not. Okay, so now we see that majority rule apparently has moved ahead of runoff voting according to the criteria that we've been talking about. Both of them satisfy the first three principles, consensus, anonymity, neutrality, but only majority rule satisfies this no vote splitting principle, the IIC principle. The problem is that majority rule has a flaw. And the flaw is that there may not always be a candidate that beats each of the other candidates by a majority. And interestingly, this fact was pointed out by Condorcet, the same philosopher who was arguing in favor of majority rule. But Condorcet realized that majority rule could fail. And here's an example of where it fails. So this is a different example from what we have been talking about. Once again, there are three groups of approximately equal proportion. These exact percentages don't matter, but the idea is that they're of roughly equal size. Now, notice that if this is the scenario, Kasich can't possibly be the winner because Rubio beats Kasich by a majority. These people prefer Rubio to Kasich. These people prefer Rubio to Kasich. That's 68%. So Kasich can't be the winner. But Rubio can't be the winner either because Trump beats Rubio. These people prefer Trump to Rubio. These people prefer Trump to Rubio, and that's 67%. But Trump can't be the winner either because Kasich beats Trump. And you know, you laugh because it seems weird at first that we could have this kind of scenario, but it's as you see, it's possible. These people prefer Kasich to Trump. These people prefer Kasich to Trump. That's 65%. So there is no majority winner. There's no majority winner. And that's the flaw. Now, could this happen? Yes, it could. I'm going to argue later that it's probably not actually that likely to happen, but it could happen. And that's a flaw. This, by the way, is called a Condorcet cycle because basically we go around in circles. Rubio beats Kasich, Trump beats Rubio, Kasich beats Trump, and around we go. Okay, so in other words, majority rule satisfies an additional principle, which we might call the decisiveness principle. The decisiveness principle says that there should be a clear winner when we run an election like this. There's no clear winner under majority rule for this example, but we want there to be a clear winner. So where are we? Oh, and runoff voting is clearly decisive. If we don't have a winner after the first round, we'll have a winner after the second round. We don't have to worry about a situation like this. So where are we now? True majority rule satisfies four principles: consensus, anonymity, neutrality, and no vote splitting. Runoff voting satisfies four principles: consensus, anonymity, neutrality, and decisiveness. The natural question to ask at this point is, well, is there some voting rule which satisfies all five principles? Unfortunately, the answer is no. And that was proved in a famous theorem. It's a mathematical theorem by Kenneth Arrow about 67 years ago. It's called the Arrow impossibility theorem. And basically, the Arrow impossibility theorem says that there is no voting rule which always satisfies these principles. So that's too bad, because all of these principles seem very reasonable and very desirable, but they're mutually contradictory. Now, that's too bad, but there's a sense in which the impossibility theorem is painting too negative a picture. Because as I was suggesting before, yes, majority rule could conceivably not work, but maybe the situations in which it doesn't work aren't very likely. So from the point of view of the Arrow theorem, to satisfy one of these principles, you have to satisfy it always, in all possible circumstances. That might be too demanding. It might not be the case, for example, that all rankings that voters could have are actually likely to happen in practice. To give an example of what I mean, if you ask a typical Republican voter about Trump, and this was certainly true a year ago during the Republican primaries, typical Republican voter either loved Trump, put him first, or hated him, put him last. So Republicans were polarized when it came to Trump, and pretty much still are. What does that mean as far as rankings go? Well, it means that a ranking like this, where Trump is first, or this, where Trump is first, or this, where Trump is last, or this, where Trump is last, all of those could happen, but we won't see people putting Trump in the middle. Or we might see them, but they'll be a pretty small fraction of the population. Now, this kind of polarization, where Trump is either at the top or the bottom, may not be great for the Republican Party, but it's very good for majority rule. And the reason why it's good for majority rule is that if we can rule out this kind of ranking or this kind of ranking as being very plausible, then it turns out that majority rule is always decisive. To go back, to go back to this example, what's important for this example to work is that all three candidates can appear in the middle. If Trump can't appear in the middle, as he does here, then we can't have a Condorcet cycle, and majority rule is always decisive. So that suggests that suggests that we should modify what we mean by a voting rule working well. We started out by saying, well, it works well if it satisfies all 5 of these principles that we laid out: consensus, anonymity, neutrality, no vote splitting, and decisiveness. Let's be a little bit more modest, and we'll say that the voting rule works well for a particular class of rankings if, when voters have rankings within that class, the voting rule satisfies all 5 properties, all 5 principles. So now working well is relative to a particular class of preferences. Which class of preferences might be relevant might depend on the circumstances. In the Republican primaries, the circumstances were that Trump was probably not going to be ranked in the middle. And now we get to another theorem, a much more recent theorem, that I established with a co-author, Partha Dasgupta, who's an economist at Cambridge University. You might call it the nomination theorem, and it says this. Suppose that you have a voting rule, any voting rule, which happens to work well, it satisfies the 5 principles for a particular class of rankings. If there's some voting rule that works well for a particular class of rankings, then majority rule must also work well for that same class. And furthermore, there must be some other class where majority rule works well and the voting rule that we started with does not. So that's a precise sense in which majority rule dominates any other voting rule. Because if the other voting rule works well in a particular set of circumstances, majority rule must also work well. And furthermore, there will be circumstances where majority rule works well and the other voting rule doesn't. And this is the reason why I was saying toward the beginning of the talk that majority rule is the direction to go in. Not because it's a perfect voting rule. We know from the arrow impossibility theorem that there's no perfect voting rule, but because it comes closer than any other to satisfying the 5 principles. Now, there's another sense in which majority rule is a step in the right direction. And this gets to a question that was asked a little while ago. Think back to last year's US presidential election. Of course, there were many voters who didn't like Trump at all. But there were a lot of voters who disliked Trump who still couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton. Those 2 candidates were pretty unpopular. They had very high unfavorability ratings. And you might say, well, under those circumstances, shouldn't there have been a sort of compromise candidate? Well, one potential compromise candidate who you might have heard of was Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg is former mayor of New York, a moderate when it comes to political views. He was a Democrat for a while, then he became a Republican, then he became an independent. He's clearly in the middle of the political spectrum. He was thinking of running originally, but then when Hillary Clinton got the Democratic nomination, Bloomberg decided to drop out. And the reason he decided to drop out, this is also the reason why Bernie Sanders decided to drop out. Neither of them were in the general election, was because they understood the vote splitting problem, and they realized that if they did run, that would be handing the election automatically to Trump. So they didn't continue. But that was sort of unfortunate from the public's perspective, because the candidates that they were left with, Trump and Clinton, neither of them was terribly popular. And it would have been nice to have more choice. Well, under majority rule, you can have more choice because now Bloomberg can run without handing the election to Trump. So here, again, this is not intended to be literally realistic, but it's not too far from realism. There are three groups of voters: the Trump supporters, the Clinton supporters, and the Bloomberg supporters. Now notice that there aren't that many people who actually put Bloomberg first. And we'll say that the Bloomberg supporters don't really distinguish very much between Clinton and Trump. They don't like either of them very much. But notice that Bloomberg is ranked second by a lot of voters. And actually the nice thing about majority rule is that not only can Bloomberg run without handing the election to Trump, because the Clinton supporters, the Bloomberg supporters, well, they don't distinguish between Clinton and Trump, but the Clinton supporters put Bloomberg above Trump. But also, Bloomberg actually wins by a majority in these circumstances, because Bloomberg beats Trump. Bloomberg beats Trump here, and Bloomberg beats Trump here, and that's 58. Oh, I've done my math wrong. It's actually 58%, not 60%, but still a majority. And Bloomberg beats Clinton here and here, and that's 60%. So I guess I got the percentages reversed, but you get the idea. Bloomberg is the majority winner, even though only 18% of the population rank him first. He's a good compromise candidate, in other words. So majority rule gives you the population the opportunity to make a compromise, to choose someone in the middle. Yeah?
Doesn't that affect like the political direction? I mean, if you're a candidate in the middle, you have a higher chance than if you're on the other side of the spectrum.
Well, not necessarily. It depends. It could be that most voters are right-wing, in which case a right-wing candidate has a better chance than someone in the middle. It all depends what you mean by the middle.
In between all other candidates.
Well, that could be a good thing. In this case, it's a good thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing. It all depends how the voters are distributed. Okay, so I've just laid out the case, or at least a lot of the case, for majority rule, which I think on both theoretical and practical grounds would be a very substantial improvement over the current system, plurality rule. is it realistic to think that it might actually be used for presidential elections? Well, here it's up to individual states. In the US, each state can decide on its own, without any federal rules or without any constitutional constraints, how it is going to award its electoral college votes. Each state could choose to award them according to majority rule. In fact, the state of Maine, in the last election, the election of last November, decided that not for president, but for governor and for senator and for representative, it's going to use something similar to majority rule, which is called instant runoff voting. So that's not quite as good as majority rule, but it's certainly much better than plurality rule. And I think we can expect other states to think about doing that too. In fact, there's a committee in Massachusetts which is hoping to do the same thing that Maine did, but in Massachusetts. So, and also cities have started using rankings to elect mayors. Some cities, like San Francisco, Minneapolis, Cambridge, Massachusetts, all of them now use rankings. So there's reason for optimism. And with that hopeful remark, let me stop and thank you.